Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, braving the cold and the streets for our second program. It's part of the Humanities Montana's Informed Citizen Series that we partnered with them for this. Tonight's program is titled What Happens in the News with Professor Dennis Swibold of the University of Montana School of Journalism. Tonight we'd also like to thank Humanities Montana for helping to fund the series through a grant program that they run. They wanted us to let you know they have donation forms available at that back table if you would like to take one. I've also given each of you a participant survey to fill out that they're going to collect. They're at the back table as well if you want to fill that out. If not, that's fine too. They just asked me to make that available to you guys. Finally, this presentation is being recorded tonight by MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television. It's part of their media assistance grant that was donated to the public library. So, without further ado, I will let Dennis take it away. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm not sure if I need a microphone or not. What do you think? Need a microphone? I've been told I'm a low talker. So if at any point in the night you think you want me to grab that microphone, I will. I think I'm being mic'd for the TV. But my name is Dennis Swibold. I'm a newspaper reporter and editor by trade and training. I went to the University of Arizona School of Journalism. I came to Montana, and in Arizona I worked at papers here and there. I was the editor of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle before I came on what I thought was just a short sabbatical to teach at the School of Journalism, and that was in the fall of '89, and I haven't left. So it's been a wonderful transition for me. I didn't expect it, but being around students keeps you young, and I enjoy their questions, and I enjoy when the light bulb goes on, and I enjoy all their struggles and their enthusiasm for what they're about to do. And there's still a lot of bright young journalists out there. Ira Sather-Olson in the back was a former student of mine. Journalists and students can do anything. They can run libraries. They can do anything. Charlie, right there, is one of my former students, a graduate student at the School of Journalism. Other people who I know in this crowd tonight, my wife Julie's here. She's going to help us make a quorum. And then Jim Strauss, the publisher of the Missoulian's, here tonight, and I've known him forever, it seems. He's been a part of the Montana journalism family for a long time. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be talking about journalism. Sometimes I think as a profession we don't do it enough. There's a lot of questions, a lot of mysteries. It's a lot like Oz. People want to know how we make those decisions behind the curtains, what sort of factors go into them, and I think people have a lot of questions that we just assume people know the answers to. So feel free to interrupt me tonight if you have questions. I'll be glad to answer what I can, but I'll draw on the expertise of the crowd if I need to, because I think you can probably answer some of your own questions too. But I want to tell you that I come from a newspaper family, in a sense. My wife's family had the Little Weekly in Harleton, Montana forever. Her father worked there for almost more than 50 years. Started there as a young printer's helper and ended up selling the paper and getting it back and running it until he finally gave it to his employees. So that's life of a small weekly publisher. My family read newspapers constantly, and my mom and dad would trade the paper at the breakfast table, and always spent some time with the editorial page, and they laughed at the cartoons. And that's what got me interested. I wanted to know why they laughed, because I wanted to make them laugh like the editorial cartoons could. And to make them do that, I found out that I had to know the news, because if you don't know the news, you don't get the joke. So that's what that was all about. So that's kind of my entree into news. And if you think about it, that's not so different than some of the Daily Show, what it used to be, or even The Onion, people who make fun and parodies of the news. I mean, it's one of the ways that people get interested in the news, because they want to get the joke. I've delivered newspapers. My family had huge paper routes. I've been part of it for myself for a long time, either as a reporter and an editor and as a teacher now. So I will talk about that mostly, but really where journalism today is online, it's electronic, it's digital. That's the future, that's the present for most news organizations, and we'll talk about that today. But I'll just sort of tell you where I came from. When I was a young man and I was watching the news, I had very few choices. I had 3 network affiliates, ABC, NBC, CBS, and I could watch their evening newscasts. They maybe had a local affiliate if I happened to be stationed in a place that had a place big enough to have affiliates for those stations. I also watched, maybe had a daily newspaper in that community, maybe another weekly, maybe not, depending if I was in a small town or a large town. So I didn't have a lot of choices when it came to news. Radio stations had a few news reporters. I remember as a young reporter actually going to cover things with radio reporters. That there was a time when they all stopped, and I didn't have too many radio reporters after a while because radio became cheaper to produce as talk radio than it was as news radio. So I saw those changes too. But I've seen a lot of changes, and I don't blame anyone who says, what's happened? What happened to that news era of my past when we had so few changes? But if you think about it, this is kind of the way it was. If you wanted to find information, it was like an oasis in the desert, and there weren't that many sources of water, if you want to equate that with information. You had these things that were scarce, that were rare, and that scarcity alone gave it a sense of authority. If you only had one network newscast for the entire country, that gave it a sense of authority that people listened to. Walter Cronkite used to tell me every night, that's the way it is. You know, what authority? I mean, can you imagine anybody speaking with that kind of authority today? That's the way it is. It won't happen anymore because you can't have that kind of authority in today's media environment back then, but you did then. And you had it with the Huntley Brinkley News Hour. You had it with on ABC with Peter Jennings. You had people that were symbols, giants, like, you know, in their field, telling you that's the way the news was. And you had it in major metropolitan newspapers, and you had them in major market newspapers too, and you had large television stations too. But that's the analogy. They had authority because they were scarce. There weren't that many places you could go to get news. And chances are, if they were in your community, you knew the people, you knew that news was being vetted, you knew that there was efforts being put into putting news together for your community about your community. That was a place that was particularly important. But there's an old story, and I want to spend some time talking to you tonight about how technology and the economics of the news have changed too to create the era that we're in right now, and that might help you understand better where we are today. This is the first newspaper, Public Occurrences. It's in Boston area. It was produced by a guy who was very much of an iconoclast. He wanted to produce a newspaper. He put just about anything he wanted to in it. He put letters in it. He wrote stuff that he couldn't verify. He stuck it in there. It was interesting. It lasted a month. Public Occurrences. Didn't last very long. He ran things that the Crown didn't like in Massachusetts Bay Colony. He ran things that he couldn't verify. And so it didn't last long. The second newspaper, the Boston Newsletter, was financed by the Crown. And you can imagine what it had in it. What do you expect? Proclamations, orders, text of bills and legislature going through Parliament, rules and regulations, and it lasted a long time, unfortunately, because it had government support, but it was dull as dirt. You wouldn't want to read the Boston Newsletter. But it also was a time after the Revolution where you had newspapers that really were factional. They broke in line with political parties. And you can see that today in news. It's kind of a throwback to that particular time. But it was a time when this cartoon about Congress was something that people might laugh about because factionalism was real, but it's not too far from the way a lot of people would look at Congress today. Right? They see a shutdown. They see the kind of antics that go on here and can laugh at that things. And the news was sort of fractured. It was frankly partisan. If you lived in most communities, you would have found at least a couple of newspapers, probably a Democrat, probably a Republican, might even be a Whig in the old days. Missoula has a boneyard full of newspapers. There's a Republican newspapers. There were Democratic newspapers. And they were that way in lots of little towns. I'm going to Red Lodge later this week. And I looked up Carbon County to see how many newspapers there had been in Red Lodge, and there had been 16 in Red Lodge, including a socialist newspaper like Missoula had at one time. So you had all sorts of political factions represented in the news, too, and that's part of what was coming along. One of the things you've got to know, too, about this communication is that it is one way, right? It's a message sent to many people. There's not a way for them to immediately respond unless they send a letter to the editor in, and that's a practice that wasn't always common among all newspapers. If you were in Montana for most of the 1950s, 1940s, 1930s, 1920s, and you subscribed to a paper run by the Anaconda Company, you couldn't even get a letter to the editor in the newspaper because that was their practice. So even as you know, they tried to have two-way communication, it didn't happen all that often, or very frequently, or very prominently in the news. So a lot of these things were one-way communication, one-to-many communication. That would change when radio would come along because you could have one to huge numbers of people, millions of people other than thousands of people. Has anybody seen the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? One of my favorite scenes in that whole movie is where the governor, the guy who wants to be reelected, goes up to the local radio station, which is just this house out in the middle of nowhere, and the announcer like speaks into a can. You know, I mean, it's a strange-looking place. And there's some people who want to meet him, standing outside to shake his hand, 2 or 3 people, and he just washes right by them. Just goes by and says, "I'm not one-to-one-ing anymore. We're mass communicating here." And I always thought that was a great analogy for what was going to happen with radio when it would come in. And it was a sweeping change. It's a long story behind radio. It's a fascinating story behind radio. But it was an opportunity for people in power to use a new medium to reach many people. Some of you may remember, probably not anybody here, but if you heard Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chats, you know that the idea of a president going over the media and talking to the people is something that's happened a long time ago. Let's see, not only presidents, Huey Long did it, Father Coughlin did it, a whole bunch of people were able to do that. If you were in Montana and the Anaconda Company owned all the newspapers, what did you do? You went to the Z-Bar network and got a statewide hookup and delivered a speech for your re-election campaign. So radio had a role to play that was kind of upsetting the apple cart in a way. It changed the way news was being delivered to people, but it was still one-to-many communication. There wasn't much of a conversation going on with that kind of communicating, and that would come in time. This was an amazing period of time that really kind of set some trends that are important for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about not only the mechanics but also the economics of newspapers. This is a guy named Benjamin Day, and he started a paper in the Sun. Its motto was, "It shines for all." And I love newspaper mottos. My favorite one is the Lewistown News Argus, right? You know it, Jim. We cover central Montana like the stars. I mean, that's the most audacious, statement you could possibly make, but I just love it because it's so audacious. Nobody else gives a damn about this place except us. And we do it very well because we care about this place. So that was the motto of the Sun. The news shines for all. And that was a kind of an interesting concept. Remember when I talked about newspapers being factional, that they maybe supported a party, or maybe if you were a U.S. Senator, you owned one. Happened in Missoula. Joseph Dixon had the Missoulian, right, a long time ago. If you were going to run for big office, you needed a mouthpiece. This is before public relations companies. Those kind of things came along. So people actually owned them for the public relations value. But he had a novel idea, and his first novel idea was, how are we going to deliver all these papers? We now have these presses that can turn out a lot more, so we can reach farther. Let's give them to kids, and let's tell the kids that they can keep the profits from 1 or 2 of those papers that they deliver every day. So now you have an incentive to peddle newspapers. And there were lots of places where you'd find people in big cities, you'd find people on street corners, the delivery guys fighting for each other for space. And in Butte, you had a Butte Newspapers Guild, a newspaper carriers guild, and they would fight over the best street corners or outside the best bars to sell their newspapers. So that was an important idea, an aggressive idea. But the other thing he thought was this, really what my job is not so much to sell newspapers to subscribers. That's important. Income from subscriptions is important. but it's not nearly as important as other things could be. What I can sell is you. I can sell your attention to advertisers, right? And if I can do that and they pay me, then I can go out and get lots of readers. I don't have to even have high subscription rates. I can do it for a penny. And I can get a lot of people into this game pretty cheaply and then sell their attention to advertisers. And that's a very old game now, and it's one that's very much still with us. If you're to look at Facebook, what do? They sell your attention span, your likes, your shares to other people, and they monetize that. That's how they make their money. So that's really one of the things that Benjamin Day came up with. Now you can see the problem here. If all I have to do is gain lots of eyeballs, I have all sorts of temptations. Scandal mongering, right? Sensationalism. The wildest stuff I can dream of. Maybe stuff that isn't even true. Maybe I can run hoaxes. Maybe stunt journalism will be something that we could do. We could send somebody around the world and follow their progress. You know, we could do all these kinds of things because we are now in the process of just gaining eyeballs that we could sell to advertisers. So this comes from the late 19th century. This is a cartoon, and you can see this guy carrying something that says fake news. Right? Cheap sensationalism, humbug news, right? Some things that are new aren't so new. They've been around for a long time. This is 19th century clickbait, if you want to look at it. If all you want to do is get people to pay attention, then you'll put anything out there that will attract their attention and click on it. But fortunately, most conscientious newspapers who were working for a community knew that that was a problem. And there was a big backlash to this. It was called yellow journalism. It probably reached its zenith in New York City thanks to William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer's big newspaper wars as they were beating each other over the head for circulation. I don't know how many of you know that William Randolph Hearst's venture into New York journalism was financed by his mother's share of his Anaconda Company stock. So there's a Montana story in everything. You know, if you really think about it, you'll find it. So all of a sudden you see this great sensationalism. But it wasn't just in New York. You looked at Denver Post in the 1890s. It was the yellowest of newspapers that you could possibly see. It had publishers who could even use their power, their circulation power, to actually practice a kind of economic terrorism, if you think about it. And extortion. If you have business rivals, you can do a crusade against them. Reduce the costs of their holdings, their land ownership, their businesses, and maybe buy them out. You could really be a bully in this business, too. So it was a nasty time, and there were a lot of people that had concerns about it, from all sorts of walks of life, from academic places to people on the street, and people in the pulpits of churches were saying, wait a minute, this isn't the way to go. This doesn't take us to a higher sort of discourse. This just takes us to the gutter. We need something that's better for that. So here, around 1908 to about 1912, 1914, there's an idea that we need to have a professional news organizations. We need to introduce professionalism into this biz. University of Montana School of Journalism in 1914, right? Think that's a coincidence? No, it's a direct reaction to this. This whole idea of yellow journalism, professionalism. It would still take a while before you see a lot of college-educated people working on newspapers, and just because you have a college education doesn't mean you're not tempted by all those other things that we've talked about so far. But it helps to set standards. It helps to set ethics, although they're really difficult to enforce in a business that is entirely independent. Congress shall make no law, the First Amendment says. And that's an important concept because you can't license a journalist. There's no bar exam you have to pass. They can't pull your professional license away and say you can't practice anymore like they can with a lawyer or a doctor or somebody else. It's one of the few businesses, maybe the only business that's protected in the Constitution. So what it has to do when it's talking about ethics is police itself. And journalists are a hard lot to police. Okay? We know that to this day. There are different strata of journalists, right? There are different kinds of journalism organizations. You can walk by the newspaper stands at the supermarket and see exactly what I'm talking about. right? You can see my favorite was the Weekly World News. Anybody ever catch the Weekly World News? It had Bat Boy and all these sort of made-up news stories in them. National Enquirer was there too, and that's still in the news for those kind of reasons that you can think about and talk about. But there's always been layers of journalists who are willing to go different ways in order to catch the eyeballs to get a lot of other people too. But professional ethics really did sort of take over, and people started talking about it. It would take journalists years before they would come up, they could even agree on a code of ethics or agree on an organization that would unite them all. We can't decide where to go to lunch. You know, I mean, we're contentious, skeptical people that like to do things our way and use our own judgments. So coming up with professional sort of ethics was a difficult thing to do. But they did, and Society for Professional Journalism was created in the 1930s, 1920s. So you can start to see a national movement with ethical practices starting to appear. And they have 4 big pillars to their ethical code. And one is to seek truth and report it. Okay? Duh. Right? Seek truth and report it. But think about how hard that is, what courage that takes sometimes. When you have a truth that's counterintuitive, that goes against what people might want to believe, that's a hard thing to say. So seeking truth and reporting it is a big deal, and it's #1 in the code for a reason. You know, it's up there because it's so important. The second one is minimize harm. Okay? What do you think about that one? Notice the semantics there. Minimize harm. What does that sound like to you? That's a hedge, isn't it? That's not do no harm. Right? Because we expect to do some harm. And you expect us to do some harm. Who do you want us to harm? The bad people, right? That harm you. You want to be told about that. You want to be informed about that. So that's why when journalists come up with this code, they say minimize harm, because we know we're going to be, anytime we cover a trial, anytime we cover a criminal charge, anytime we cover an investigation, we're probably going to do harm. We just want to make sure that we don't do collateral damage to people who aren't involved in some sort of way. It's a more difficult thing to do than you might know. The third thing is act independently. That had been a problem with yellow journalism. The news wasn't independent of the people who funded it. Right? Still a problem. Can still be a problem. You know, so independence. Who's paying you? Where's that coming from? Who's in control of that news? That was something that the journalists who were putting together these codes started thinking about. And the fourth one was be accountable. What does that mean? Anybody has an idea? Be accountable. Well, how does a journalism organization be accountable? Admit your mistakes. And what does a good admission of a mistake contain? I'm sorry. Me sorry. What else does it contain? If you're going to believe it and accept it. A big mistake. Huh? Acknowledge what you've done and how you made the mistake. You know, and I teach an ethics and trends class in the school, and we study some major mistakes in journalism, and I love to look at the retractions. I love to diagnose what they say about how they got it wrong. And when people ask me, as they invariably do at these presentations, well, whom do you trust today? I always say, I tend to trust people who admit their mistakes. You know, that's not a bad way to separate people on reliability. You want them to have a track record of credibility. You want them to get it right most of the time. But when they do make a mistake in this fast-paced business and news, if they are able to tell you that they make a mistake, and more importantly, if it's a big mistake, come to terms with how they made it, that's an important thing that helps to lend trust to what you do. At about this time, you also saw this economic force taking control that did lend itself to a focus on facts over opinions. And that's because you had a mass audience that you were trying to appeal to. Not so much not the Democrats or the Republicans or this faction or that faction. You're trying to appeal to all of them. And if you think about that, that's a pretty huge spectrum, right, of beliefs and ideas. So what you try to do is focus on facts over views and news and opinions. So this became kind of the objective model. It fit well with the economic model for news in a long time, and you start to see news overviews. And I love this from Jamie Gordon Bennett at the New York Herald. Our only guide shall be good, sound, practical, common sense applicable to the business and the bosoms of men engaged in everyday life. Notice that he only said men, right? That's another problem with the news, right? Those stories were one-way communication. We love to say as journalists that we hold up a mirror to our communities, but if you look back through a lot of journalism's history, you'll see there were a lot of people not reflected in those mirrors, including about half the people here, okay, in a lot of ways. So that's an interesting part of the story. So news has a lot of growing to do, and it's still growing to do. It still reflects the tensions of its time. We started to see two-way communication now with the telegraph. And I love this cartoon. It's the pundits of the day worried that the telegraph was too fast for the truth. We won't be able to check. We won't be able to verify because we're going to get this information like within minutes, you know, within hours of when it happens. We're going to get news reports. That's almost laughable today. Right? You get it on your Twitter feed within seconds of news happening. It's almost too fast for the truth, right? I think you could still probably make that argument for today because news requires some thought, some consideration, some verification, some checking, some editing in order so that you can have some faith in it. But we start to have a two-way communication going on. People can talk to each other. Radio gets bigger. Probably some of you remember growing up around the radio set, listening to the shows. What were your favorites? Anybody recall any?
Lone Ranger.
The Lone Ranger, that's a good one. Anybody else?
Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Rider.
Ooh, that's a good one. I don't think I've heard of that one. I'm going to look that one up. I was an Air Force brat, and I grew up in Taiwan, and we didn't get American television, so we got old Armed Forces radio shows. And I listened to The Shadow Knows. The door opening. I listened to Gunsmoke as a radio show, which when I came back to the States, I was surprised to see as a television show because that guy didn't sound like anything. It's anything like the Matt Dillon on the radio show. But it would change a lot. And television, of course, was huge. Now we're talking about audiences of multi-millions, mega millions. Audiences. And these three network news shows, and probably CBS, which was considered the Tiffany of the networks, was probably the news leader in most ways for an awful long time. And again, they could tell you because they were so powerful, they were worldwide in their scope and their outreach. They had stars who worked for them. And the names were household names of their correspondents. I've met some of these people, and they were like giants who walk the earth, you know, and I don't know that they're like we'll ever see again, but they did have that kind of power that Walter Cronkite certainly would, and he envisioned that he might. This is a timeline that I think kind of gives you some basic facts about some of the history and the economics that were going along. Newspapers and television starts to make inroads. Television and radio starts to make inroads in newspaper circulation in the 50s and through the 60s. So a lot of towns that had many newspapers now have one. Okay? A lot of towns, including towns in Montana. You know, when Lee bought the newspapers in Montana, it said, why do we have two? We've got a competitive situation here. We need to consolidate our papers, make them stronger, make them robust, make them better at doing what they're doing so they can meet the competition. But if you were in Butte at one time, there were 4 daily newspapers in Butte. You know, 4 daily newspapers in Butte. Yes, I'm not kidding. But you were in Chicago, there were, you know, almost a dozen. If you were in New York, there were so many that almost every newspaper in the 50s had a hyphenated name because it was caused by mergers of other newspapers. My wife's hometown paper is the Harlowton Times-Clarion, Times-Clarion, right? Because that was a merger even at the localist level because these economic situations tended to filter down in little communities. So you saw this competition take a toll. But what it really did was make the newspapers themselves probably more robust and probably better at what they were doing, gave them bigger staffs, they can consolidate their resources, and they would maintain their high levels of circulation for a long time. This was kind of a zenith in terms of the number of newspapers, but then you saw that number sort of fall over time. I think the top of the line for newspaper circulation was about 1984, when it was enormous. It was huge. And then it would see a decline after that. And you would see newspaper circulation, this is 1960, if you can't see this, to 1917. So you can see what's going on there. And what you're seeing is competition. You're seeing competition from other resources, some of which aren't even technically news. They're competing. Daily mailers that you get in the mailbox, that's advertising too. When I worked in a newspaper, I was fairly naive about all of this, I must confess. I was the editor of a newspaper, and I was fairly naive about this, I confess. Every day this train would come through, and it had advertising on it, and had all these empty cars. And it said, okay, Swibold, put your news on there. And I put everything I could to fill up those cars. I put a lot of news on there, and it drove away. And that train kept coming through and kept coming through. But that was an advertising model that was really unique for a long time, and a powerful model. It's what paid for much of news. And here's an idea I want to leave you with too, is that news has always been subsidized. Think about it. Somebody else paid for most of your news. Now, you might have paid for some with circulation fees, but advertisers paid for the bulk of news. Somebody else paid for what you saw in that form. So how much did average individuals value news? Well, we would find out, because the internet has that wonderful sort of leveling quality that's kind of frightening sometimes. Every piece of news then had to live on its own merits in some respects. It could be good for the community, it could be a strong piece of news, but if it didn't have much attention, how much weight should we give it in terms of our news digest and how much role we should play? Good newspapers would say a lot. Other newspapers would say, we're not going to run that stuff anymore. So you can see different attitudes, different changes, different ideas in how we're going to treat the news because of what's going on here today. This TV starts to get more robust, and there start to be more TV shows. It's not just the nightly newscast. It's the Today Show every morning. My mom used to watch it religiously. You know, I would do the ironing with her in the morning. We would watch that going on. We'd come home to the local newscast too. And then in the 80s, you started to see all of this change really pick up steam, incredible pace. In the 1980s, you start to see Ted Turner launches CNN, his network, and then you start fiber optic cable, which changes the game for television incredibly. Now you have 500, 600, I don't know how many channels you have now. You have lots of channels today, a lot more competition, and it's in a closed, not over-the-air circuit. So you can change the rules in terms of what can be on TV. That's why your racier shows can be on cable than they can be on the over-the-air networks. So that has changed in this environment too. You also see an abandonment of something called the Fairness Doctrine, which applied to broadcasting. Anybody know about the Fairness Doctrine and how it worked? Can you remember about that? Who's got an idea about it? Has anybody ever had benefited from the Fairness Doctrine? Have you ever gone to your local TV or radio station and said, I want equal time?
Yes, you have to balance.
That was the idea. If a local TV station did an editorial or radio station did an editorial, you could go to them and demand equal time. They had to pay for your time to be on that station to give your opinion in rebuttal to that. Okay? Well, the news and the economic environment for the news had changed. Now you have so many more television stations because of cable. It's just an explosion. So it's not like over the air where you're using the public airways for one big station, right? You're having a lot of competition now. So why do we need to regulate this? The same thing happened to radio, satellite radio. How many of you have satellite radio? A lot of people do. And there are a lot of satellite radio stations. So if we have all this competition, why do we need to regulate something called the fairness doctrine? Should we? If you don't like what I say on my station, you can go to another station that will probably say the things that you like. Okay? So the fairness doctrine gets eliminated, and it's dropped. And what does radio news do? That's when I saw the disappearance of all the radio reporters at the things I used to cover. They went away because news was likely to spark intense feelings. Intense feelings sparked opinion. Opinion sparked fairness doctrine things. So if we don't have to do local news at the radio stations, we can just play talk radio and don't have to worry about giving people fair time or free time to respond to that. We're just not going to do news. And talk radio was a lot cheaper. All you had to do is plug in a cassette. That's a show. And you might have got it recorded hours ahead of time. So talk radio just takes off through the roof in the 80s. And Rush Limbaugh, makes a market that, most people in the media could only dream about because of his network of broadcasting stations. And you saw the same thing happen in television with Rupert Murdoch, who's a media mogul, who's an old newspaper guy from Australia, really. That's really what he likes, is newspapers. But he also got into broadcasting. And he had a guy working for him who was a political consultant to the Republican administration named Roger Ailes. And Roger Ailes really knew that a conservative TV station that was on cable, not broadcast over the air, on cable, could really appeal to people of certain factional beliefs, right? Same thing at MSNBC. We could do that. We could break these markets we could fracture them along factional lines. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Have we been there before? And these are not small markets. I think Fox is the favorite, most trusted news station in Montana, according to a survey done 2 or 3 years ago, and it's the most trusted news medium by 14% of the people, which means a whole lot of other things got a lot of trust too. Okay, so only 14%, I think that's kind of small, but when you think of 14% in terms of numbers of people who watch, that's a big number. That's a nice niche. That's a really big niche. That's a convenient niche. That's a lucrative niche. So you see that Fox News found a great niche, and they said, yeah, we found a great niche. The people who didn't, Republicans or conservatives, had their own publication that they could use. You start to see satire take off on mostly cable programs. The Stewart Show, The Daily Show that I talked about. The Onion as a newspaper becomes a digital online site that's still there today. And you can go there and have a good laugh if you want to. And The Onion tends to be tweeted a lot. Why? Because what kind of things do we tweet? Things that make us what and what? I'm leading the witness here. Right? That's what I do in class. Sorry. We tend to tweet things that make us laugh outrageously, usually based on some sort of belief or anger or opinion that we have. A lot of comedy is based on anger, if in case you haven't studied it very much. But also the things that make us really angry, right? So those kind of things tend to go viral before anything else, and we'll talk about that more ever in a bit. The 2000s, this cemented the revolution. This really was the decade that changed everything. And you saw what not only Facebook in 2004, but Twitter in 2006, these social media platforms that were good at things that other media, old media, was not. They weren't one-to-many. They weren't just a two-way communication. They could create conversations among everybody here in this room and allow people who had share news that they read in traditional news media and spread it around to everybody else too. So these platforms are incredibly important because they take advantage of the Internet's ability to connect us all in different ways. We can form groups. Anybody here part of a Facebook group? I am. I have to be. It's part of my job to be a part of a Facebook group. I'm part of the School of Journalism Facebook group. I'm a part of the School of Journalism Alumni Scholarships and Jobs Facebook group, right? That's important. I want to get jobs for my people. But those Facebook groups have several hundred people, not big, A lot of alums, but they're important. And I can not only talk to many people, but they can talk to each other while I'm not there. And they can share ideas, they can share tips, just like you can for your families. This is really a brilliant idea when you think about it. And it started out with the concept of friends. Right? We're going to let friends talk to each other. Oh, perfect. Perfect. I mean, who do you trust more than anybody else? Maybe your friends, maybe your neighbors, maybe your relatives. But why would they lead you wrong? Why would they steer you wrong? They love you. They care about you. Right? That's kind of a feeling that most people would have. So you can already see a different kind of dynamic going on. You can create large groups. You can create conversations within those groups. That's why they call it social media, and that's why it's so powerful. There's incredible promise and opportunity there. You have the world at your fingertips. You can do amazing bits of education and collaboration. You can organize in ways that are amazing. You can also create propaganda. You can also do all the things that yellow journalism allowed you to do back in the old days on social media too. And the social media operators, they don't want to be editors. They don't really want to do that. Why? Why doesn't Mark Zuckerberg want to be an editor?
You want to be accountable.
Huh?
Accountability.
Maybe. I suppose that's the exact reason. It's an overwhelming job, and I can make plenty of money without having to do an overwhelming job and be accountable. What a perfect situation for me. In fact, if I write an algorithm, what's that? That's a way that feeds me the information I want. And how does that algorithm work? Everything I like, everything I look at, everything I talk to somebody else about, everything I share comes back to me many-fold. My friends' shares, their likes comes back to me many-folds. And it becomes a perfect sort of advertising vehicle too. Facebook sells you and your friends and their data to advertisers too. Okay, so in some ways it's the same game played on a massive sort of interconnected scale. That's really been important for what's happened to the news culture here, and I think you got to admit it. You got to talk about it, how it works and how it doesn't work sometimes. So you can also see that private data can get stolen. You can see that fake news accounts, bots, phony stories can get weaponized. You can see some of my favorite stories. And I said, this is twisted. I know, it's perverse. But it's about people who create sort of fake news and how much money they make. And they don't really care about who pays attention to it all that much. As long as I can start a fight and get both sides of a crowd, I can make money by getting both of those groups activated against some sort of issue. I can get Trump people and Clinton people to show up at protests across the street, and I can make money by selling advertising to all their friends and their relatives because of that, what I have done. So it becomes open to all sorts of stuff, like fake accounts. How are we going to get rid of those? Well, we're going to try really hard to get rid of fake accounts, and every week you hear there's a whole bunch of new ones they found, right? Because it's so easy to create them, so easy to replicate them, so easy to replicate anything digitally that it's created a problem. Here's a Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses President Trump for president, release a statement. That's a classic fake news story that came out during the election. And you know my students, they're pretty good at spotting this stuff. They are amazingly good at spotting this stuff. They're better than I am at spotting this stuff. Why do you think that? And they look at me like, yeah. I know we are. It only stands to reason, Swibold. Right? Because we're born in this environment. We're part of this environment. We know what social media is like. We know that we've seen bullying on this environment. We know what to watch for. We know what the code words look like. We know that if the URL ends in .co, that it's probably fake. We know if there's a lot of caps and a lot of apostrophes, that it's probably fake. We know those things sort of intuitively because we've seen a lot of this stuff for most of our lives. So in some ways, they're pretty good at spotting this stuff. It's people of my generation that maybe have a more difficult time and have to go look for help. But I just turn to my students and say, what do you think? And they can usually give me enough semantical reasons to make me suspicious, and then I can find other ones to talk about sources. So remember the picture of the desert? We have all these watering holes. This is a city underwater. And that's kind of the analogy today. We have so much information, and so much of it is out there, and so much it can be diametrically opposed to what you think you know, that it's a kind of a free-for-all in that respect. If I have a conversation and I give you my point of view about something, there's somebody who come up with and start talking about Bigfoot, and he has just as much viability in that discussion as perhaps I do, has just as much access to a number of people in that situation. So there's kind of a leveling of access to medium. In the old days, there was a barrier to entry. How many of you had your own newspaper? How many of you had your own TV station? It was hard to do. You had to have a lot of friends. And even if you were even in the 50s and 60s and 70s, even in places like Montana, if you wanted to be successful at these things, you probably had groups of news or papers, because it was hard to make money just owning one. You could maximize your resources. You could share expertise across the groups. So in Montana today, we have several large groups that own weekly newspapers, which tended to be mostly community-owned. And we have had groups that have owned most of the daily newspapers for several decades now, many decades now, which is the American model across the country. It's not a surprise. We have some vast sort of chains. We have ones that are owned by public investor on the stock exchange. We have ones that are owned by private ownership, private shareholders who are less accountable to the public than publicly owned companies that report to the stock market. And now we have a third owner that's getting to be bigger in size than ever before, and it's almost up to half. That's holding companies, investment companies, buying newspapers who have a much different idea about what journalism ought to mean to a community. They see that as an investment just like they would if they owned, a hot dog stand, or if they owned something else. So if you see changes in the media environment, you see that, and there's properties that aren't very economical or not that viable, and they're owned by a holding company, they're pretty quick to jettison them, or they're pretty quick to sell them for their parts. Their real estates were something, right? Their technologies were something, right? These are assets that they can then turn around and sell, or move to other papers, or close, those kind of things. There's a phenomenon that we're starting to see, and I read a great report out of the University of North Carolina just recently called The Emergence of News Deserts. And it showed all the counties in America that used to have many newspapers, they don't have any. Okay, and the number is up like 1,800, I think, had been lost. Somewhere around that number. Montana was pretty fortunate because we didn't have any counties we had some counties that didn't have papers, but we didn't have investor-owned papers. Almost all of them were in the hands of people who had groups and pretty substantial, long-held ownership in that area. So the risk was less likely to be turned over into the hedge funds that were investing in news and media properties. Although that can change. And it can change pretty quickly these days, too, if people get into trouble. And that's why ownership matters, and it's why you ought to pay attention to it, too. So it's everywhere. But it's also why this cartoon is funny. Okay? It makes sense now, because you can see it's Fox News. They started the Civil War. Well, what's not funny is that there was a real Civil War, and it was started by real factions in America, and newspapers and media grew out of it in a way that you wouldn't imagine. The first interview was conducted during the Civil War, because you didn't really have reporters going out and ask questions before. Most generals thought reporters were spies. So it's been a long, hard fight just to be a journalist. But this is a cartoon that I think makes sense. And I like this comment from Clay Shirky. There's no way to get Cronkite-like consensus without somebody like Cronkite. And there's no way to get someone like Cronkite in a world with an internet. There will be no more men like him because there will be no more jobs like his. Okay? What do you think of him? Can there be a Walter Cronkite again? Could there be somebody with that sort of, then that's the way it is? Could be on a cable channel, could have kind of influence, but probably not an over-the-air media ever again. Not that sort of mass audience that Walter Cronkite had in the past. So you ought to read some Clay Shirky. He's provocative as hell. He really does make you think, and he makes you challenge you to think that our idea of truth is just a consensus of what people that are in authority tell us, or a consensus of what our friends think. I don't buy that entirely, but there are aspects of it that's true. And it's worthy for journalists to read this kind of criticism and ponder how they feel about this. Have you heard about these? Filter bubbles? You know what a filter bubble is? If you're on social media, anybody who watches their grandkids on Facebook? Tell me you don't. Tell me you don't watch your uncles and you don't lurk a little bit like that. I do. Okay, I watch this kind of stuff. But one thing about Facebook and social media is that I have friends, and I invite people to be my friends, and when they're my friends, their likes and their stuff comes back to me. So all of a sudden I have created kind of a bubble of people who are like-minded, and it's hard sometimes to break out of that and encounter ideas and views that I disagree with. During the last election campaign, I have a lot of friends, and a lot of those friends turned out to be Democrats, obviously from the advertising that was showing up on my social media feed. I didn't see much in the way of Republican advertising. And I was covering the election with a group of students. So I went out and friended all the Republican candidates just so that I could get their advertising and I could see what messages they were trying to make. I have to break out of this bubble if I'm going to hear views that contradict my own and I can have a discussion with myself that's honest and fair. I have to know what's going on. If I just stay within my bubble and I just reinforce what I think among the people I'm in, that bubble better be big. You know, because if it's not, you can find yourself going down some paths that you may not want to. I would argue that one of the ways to get out of the bubble is local news. Because we as communities connect in ways that are beyond social media. If you're part of a church, you're part of a community group, you're part of a volunteer organization, you have a common point of information about local controversies or something like a newspaper still, then you have ways that you can meet people who are not like you and interact. And the minute you do that, you start to break down the own barriers in your mind. And some of these things, some of these biases created by filter bubbles are what human behaviorists call cognitive dissonance, cognitive bias. You know, that's a fancy term that says we want to believe what we want to believe. And some of these behaviorists think that we're hardwired to do that as human beings. It comes from when we were in small groups running around on the prairies with spears. You know, what was important to us? To have other people like us to protect us. We didn't like to stray from the group. That was bad. So we tend to believe people who are not different from us in some sort of way. Tribalism is another word for it. Yeah, it can be. But there's all sorts of cognitive dissonance. There's psychic dissonance, which means we feel really uncomfortable when we hold beliefs that are different from people that we admire or are like. We have a hard time disagreeing. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us sick to our stomachs, you know, because we feel like we're out of sync with our friends and people and those kind of things too. So that's another form of cognitive bias that we have out there. We also have motivated reasoning. How many people are really going to disagree with some sort of fact or some sort of theory or philosophy that directly contradicts the way you get paid? It's hard for people to come out against somebody who come out the way you get paid and disagree with that. And that manifests itself.
What you mean by that?
Well, if there's an industry that happens to be creating a problem and you're worried about that, and you find information that tells you that the industry is creating a problem and you're employed by the industry, you're going to have a hard time disagreeing. That's motivated reasoning. You're motivated to think like the people who are part of you and in that group. So there's all sorts of things that may have started as sort of self-protection mechanisms that probably don't work anymore now that we're not on the prairie in small groups with spears. But they're relics of kind of our psychological and human behavior past. And that makes us susceptible. It makes us open to fake news. It makes us believe things because we want it to be true. We want others to think that, who agree with it, to think that we think that way. We want to be part of groups, and we share them on, or we tend to react with anger and outrage to things that we see. How many of you have shared fake news? Come on. I'm raising my hand. I passed on a tweet one time that wasn't true. And why did I do it? Because it made me mad.
Raged.
Instantly. And that was a great lesson. So if you see something that makes you mad or strikes you as hilariously funny, you might want to sit on it for a little bit. There can be some gratification in being the first one to tweet that and see all the likes that you're getting. People retweet it, but if it's wrong, it can redound on you to your detriment. So that's a problem with fake news to some ways.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About your question, how real is your news? Well, without the fairness doctrine, I mean, I don't trust much of anything that I hear. It doesn't matter if it's on NPR or whatever. You know, it's just like, I'm not sure that this is really balanced.
Well, I'm going to take you through a construct that might help you separate fact from fiction. Okay. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to believe me either. Okay? You have perfect...
And this is nothing fake about this, by the way.
Yeah, nothing.
Real.
Nothing. This is going to be real. This is going to be real. Totally real. But it makes you think about things. How do you know something's true? How do you, we've already talked about one thing that might persuade you to believe that something's true. And that's from a trusted, credible source who admits when they get it wrong. Right? So keep that in mind. Who gets it wrong? Who's willing to say that they get it wrong from time to time? That might be something that's important for you to help make your mind about this kind of stuff. These are the dissonances. We tend to trust feelings and search for just the facts that support our feelings. It's called confirmation bias. Reporters can fall victim to this. Journalists can fall victim. People can fall victim to this. We come up with an idea that we think is true or a feeling that we think is true, and we go out and we look for the facts that support it. Right? Ignoring salient facts on the other side of the picture.
The opposite of the scientific method.
Huh?
It's the opposite of the scientific method.
Yeah, which is, and I hate to use this word because it gets us into semantics, and nobody really sort of understands what objectivity means. What do you think objectivity means? It used to be kind of an ideal and a goal we used to talk about a lot in journalism, but now I hardly use the word because so many people misunderstand it or think it's something else. What do you think objectivity means?
Having the whole picture.
Having the whole picture. That's not a bad definition. Okay. Questioning everything. It's weighing and balancing everything and coming up with conclusions based on a lot of evidence. I think a lot of people think it means, well, I've got both sides. And I don't think that's objectivity at all. I think that's symmetry. You're confusing objectivity with symmetry. And if I think of objectivity, I think of scales. Where's the weight of the evidence? If I'm a jury in a civil trial, I have to make my decision based on the preponderance of the evidence. That's the legal standard. Okay? So it's important for me to say, where's the weight of that evidence? So if nine scientists think that global warming exists, and one scientist thinks it doesn't, what do you think?
Yep, agree with 9.
Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other things that we can talk about here. There's a difference between global warming and average temperatures and weather, which is entirely highly localized and varied. And talk to me, I mean, so why you can stand outside today and say, there's no such thing as global warming, we're standing up to here in snow, you know? But that doesn't understand the mega answers to those kinds of questions.
I've been thinking, kind of wanted to save till the end, but you brought up something I've been thinking about quite a bit, which is this bogus version of objectivity, which seems to be more prevalent in American media, particularly broadcast media, and what little I've seen overseas.
Why do you think that is?
Well, let me just say what I mean, which is more often American broadcast media feel compelled, excuse me, to interview people from both sides and to leave unchallenged whatever they say. Whereas what I've seen of British broadcast media, for example, they'll both challenge more often, and they won't feel compelled to bring on the other side, because they see that the side that they're presenting is the more truthful and accurate one. This has been brought out about American journalism, especially the broadcast side, in recent years, but I haven't seen much change in that. It seems as though reporters and editors in American broadcast media seem compelled, as if they're scared to be seen as at all partisan. And that doesn't seem to budge.
Well, I think, there's a lot of, what do you think are possible explanations for what he's observing? Anybody?
Advertisers.
Advertisers, you think that they're worried about advertisers?
Appealing to a greater audience.
Appealing to a mass audience, and you don't know the truth of things that happen quickly? So what do? Grab political partisan kind of views and get... I've been guilty. I've written he said stories. I've played that game. And mostly it happens because of speed. It happens because we tend to think sometimes that we get into this mindset of there are only two sides to a story. And I can't tell you how struck I was by that when I first started teaching journalism.
But I guess I want to point out that American media seems to be deadly fearful of even presenting that there's only one side. For example, climate change.
Well, I mean, think about the economic model that we were just talking about of mass mediums and the business model of objectivity. If I'm trying to appeal to all these spectrums, that's a scary place for me to be. Clay Shirky, he says, the job of journalists today is to find the operational consensus among relevant operators. Now that's really nerdy talk. But what he's saying is, who's got the weight of the evidence and who doesn't? And that's a job for journalists to sort that out. Now, why is that a scary place for a lot of journalists to be? What does that feel like if you're doing that? Feels like bias. It feels like you're being impartial. It goes against maybe the grain of what you think you've been taught. Get both sides to the story.
How come they feel freer in Britain?
Because they have a different sort of model. Because who pays for the news there? They do. The BBC has a tax on those TV sets, right? It's government-financed news. It's a different sort of ownership model. So ownership models matter, and it's something to think about too. But I do think that's part of the reasoning and what goes on. And I remember taking a city council class to the Missoula City Council meeting years ago. And Ira, I'm sure, was there. I was probably in the front row. No, that's fake news. But I had one student write a story that was just really superficial and didn't get at the sense of the whole debate. And he says, well, I got both sides of the story.
Yeah.
Okay. And somebody said, well, you're in Missoula. There are 12 sides to the story. And that made me laugh out loud when I heard that. But I've been to city council meetings, and it was true. There were 12 sides to that story. So what your job was then, and could you do it in a handful of minutes? Could you do it in seconds? How do you separate the relevant actors and the relevant sources? It takes time. Good journalism, good verification, good checking to make sure you know what's right, or make that decision about weight is not something that's simple. It takes knowledge, it takes research, it takes training, it takes time. It's too fast for the truth sometimes, right? I think that can happen. Speed kills is another way to say this. Here's another one. We often tend to overestimate our knowledge. We can't see what we don't know. And everybody has fallen victim to that. I mean, everybody in here can probably say that. But skepticism is a weapon. And if I can encourage you to be anything tonight, it's skeptics. Okay? Now, before you get too far into the skepticism, I also want to tell you what cynicism is. Or let's talk about that for a minute. Because that's where you cross the line from being a skeptic. What's a cynic?
Not believing anything.
Yeah. Okay, if I had to have a phrase to describe a cynic, it would be, so what? Skeptic could be, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Skeptic, so what? You don't care. Truth doesn't matter if you're a cynic, because it doesn't make any difference anyway. But you're a skeptic, you might get to the bottom of questions. You might use that native skepticism to say, what's wrong with that argument? Is there another point of view that I'm missing here? What's the weight of the evidence there? How am I going to do this research to find out the truth? All those things that I think journalists need to do, and it's so much harder to do at the pace at which they're asked to produce. So these are great things that you can do. These are how-to tips. Who's telling me this? I hear a piece of information. Is it supported by a particular side, paid for, bought in research? Is it by one of the political parties? Is it by a manufacturer? Is it by somebody who has a vested interest in telling me their side of the story that enriches them? Okay? That's one of the ways that, I mean, we all think about advertising that way. What are they selling? What are they getting out of this? Is that true? Cigarettes are healthy for you. Right? That was a line that was peddled in this country for a long time. And all they had to do was sow doubt, bits of doubt in your mind about the facts that science would put out to make you think that that was fake news too. How did they know? Somebody tells you something, I always say, well, what's your source? You know, where'd you get that from? That's not a rude question for people who care about truth. That's an essential question. Bob Schieffer was a CBS correspondent and one of my favorites. And maybe you know about Bob Schieffer. But he used to always say there's really two great questions for journalists. One is, what do you mean by that? And they're all follow-up questions, which I always think are true too. The best questions are follow-up questions. Not just the main question, but the follow-up. What do you mean by that? You know, what is it you're really getting at? And it also implies, how do you know? What's your source? And can you give me an example of that, which also says, let me see your sources. Let it play out for me. Show me that how you know what you know. What aren't they saying? Are they leaving out aspects of the story, salient views? Are they leaving out other pieces of evidence that you might have? What's in it for them? What don't I know that I should? Boy, that's a hard one. There was a managing editor for the Wall Street Journal a long time ago called Vermont Royster. And I used to read his speeches because he wrote great editorials that made good classroom kind of speeches. And one of the things that he said, that he wasn't so worried about bias so much, he said, because all journalists take part of are passionate, are part of their times, and they take part in that bias sometimes. But most of what I see as bias is really just carelessness and ignorance, or both. You know, and that people, it looks as biased because the reporter didn't even know there were 2 sides, or 3 sides, or 12 sides, or whatever the case might be. And one of his punchline to the speech was, the one thing a good education ought to make you is humble about what you do not know. And that's the best place to be. You know, I think you have to admit that I just don't know, and I have to find out, because it's hard for you to find out if you think that you know. It's hard for you to ask really sort of basic questions. So it's dangerous, I think, for you to get too solidified in what your beliefs are, because you might find that there's a reason for that. So skepticism is a virtue. I believe that. I think it's important. Beware of promises of imminent disaster, amazing cures, and instant wealth. You know that. Okay? From advertising. You've been a victim of advertising for a long time, right? It may help you buy things. It gives you information about things you'll want to buy. But you're also skeptical of it too, right? Because they're trying to sell you something. You know what's in it for them. They have a vested interest there. So you're going to ask these questions of advertisers to make sure you understand it. Imminent disaster, amazing cures, instant wealth. Remember those cartoons that say, the guy that would say, the end is near? You know? You know, I've seen them for decades now, those cartoons about that. I'm still around. Stories that sound too strange or too funny to be true. I would even say photos that look too strange or too funny to be true. And I teach my students how to look for fake photos, how to do reverse Google searches, and how to look at the data in photos to see if they've been manipulated. Stories that make you instantly angry or afraid, I would say, or mad. And polls, I'm death on polls these days. It is so hard to do a poll. It's so hard to do a good poll. And almost all of them require about it's just as much art as they do science. How do you weight them? Yeah, we have a survey. Why are polls so hard to do these days?
Cell phones.
Yeah, that's part of it. But the problem is you. How many of you like to do polls, like to respond to polls on the phone?
You can't get a representative population in a poll.
Nationally, they're having a difficult time doing them because they get single-digit response rates. Single-digit response rates to polls. Montana actually does better than the nation in polls. People in Montana are more likely to participate in polls than people from other places. So congratulations. And sometimes I had a pollster complain one time, says it's going to take 20 minutes to get Montanans to go through the whole questionnaire because they'll answer every question, you know. But still, there's a problem with getting a full enough response that makes sense to a lot of people. So it can be a difficult time to do polls, as the last election showed people. What are polls? They're snapshots in time. What are polls? They're probability, almost all probability polls. And what's the best probability poll that you live with every day? What's the first probability? The weather. Exactly. What's the chance of rain today? And that's the way you ought to approach most polls. What's the chance today of this happening? And the chance means that if it's 30% chance of rain, means there's a 70% chance it won't. Right? That's what that means. And we'll see how well they do their research. Is the info verifiable with reputable sources? And, you know, reputable sources, I trust people in my community who know the people in my community and know who's reputable and who's not over time. And they have to be people who have been here enough time so they know people and they know who's reliable and they know their history. They know whether they've told the truth. They know if they've been sued for bad business practices. They know if they've lied in court trials. They know these things about people. So editors tend to be good people who know the reliability of sources. If there's one thing you can trust about an editor is that they know who reputable sources are. So is it verifiable with reputable sources? You see something that's fake, I look for traditional kind of media to see if they've picked up the story. That's the first thing I do. And if they haven't, I wonder why not. Something's wrong. They're worried about this. Now, it could be that they just aren't on it yet. But then I can look at a lot of different media, and maybe I'll not hit that retweet button quite so fast. Because I'm trying to see if anybody else is buying this stuff too. But there's a danger because a lot of people are fast on those tweet buttons. Is the source reliable? In other words, do they have a track record of being reliable in the past on this kind of information? Does the source quickly and fully admit mistakes? We talked about this one before. And fact-check this stuff. There's wonderful sort of fact-checking machines out there that you can use. Factcheck.org comes out of the Annenberg School of Communication at USC, and they're pretty good. And they'll show you their sources. They'll show you why they say something. You have to find something that's fact-checkable, which is more harder than you think. But what is the statement of fact that they're making that you can check? We did this with my students in my elections class. It was harder than you thought to really fact-check somebody who's making a lot of points or talking off the cuff or exaggerating, as people often do when they speak. PolitiFact comes out of the Tampa Bay Tribune, comes out of the Poynter Institute, comes out of, and I love it because what they have is these wonderful little images on their fact checks. And it says, true. It's a little meter, it's like a gauge. It says, true. And it says, half true. And it says, half true, half false. Mostly false. And then finally, when it's a real humdinger, they say, pants on fire, and the whole meter's on flame. Okay? The Washington Post has one, too, that's called, it goes by Pinocchios. And they have, how many Pinocchios does that story or that statement get? And that makes some people mad when they get lots of Pinocchios. But that's what they're saying. Can I verify this fact? Can I show this information? Snopes is a good one to take a look at, although they're having some financial problems. It's hard for these guys to exist, too. They need money. How do you sell advertising on a fact-checking site? How do you do that thing without foundation support or other kind of things? It's hard. But they're a good one, too. They specialize in fake news about celebrities and fake news about pop culture. I have a game show that I play for high school students when they come to the J School every spring. It's called the Fake News Game Show. And I put up something about Beyonce or some rapper or something like that that's fake news because Snopes tells me it's fake news. And I know it's fake news just because Snopes told me, because I don't follow this stuff. And they have to come down and they have to guess, and they compete, and they hit these buzzers, and then we, after like 4 or 5 different competitions, we tally up the points and see who's ahead, and then we have a commercial. And our advertisers are factcheck.org, Political Fact, Snopes, and Google's reverse photo search. So we teach people how to look at information literacy. How do we check stuff? What kind of sources do we have? We have power. And I think young people can spot this kind of stuff, but they can't often explain why that's false. So they need these sort of vehicles to help them kind of look up the truth and where to find it. And one thing I find that a lot of young people have trouble with is searching. Okay, they may know the internet and social media like nobody's business, but coming up with the keywords for a search is really kind of an art. And you've got to know publications. You've got to know what words they use. You've got to know the semantics of news before you can even come up with good searches. So that's part of the thing we teach people, too. So information literacy is huge.
How can we take your course? Are you signed up through the...
President Bodner? President Bodner? Are you hearing this?
Do you teach a Molly class?
I have taught a Molly class, and I may offer to do it again. But it's a lot of fun. And what we do is find ways to see what's true and what's not. And what's half true, what's almost true, what's partially true, and what's pants on fire. You know, we can come up with those gradients as we look for sources. You could actually put a photo in Google and search to see if it has been replicated elsewhere, where it originated from. And that's what a Google reverse search does.
I'll give an example. Last year there was a story around the grizzlies had gotten into the Big Belt Mountains. And we used Google, we searched it, and the photo of the grizzly, Google quickly recognized that was a photo from the Rocky Mountain front. And 2 or 3 media outlets had picked up on that story, and then we had the story that, no, this was a fake photo. So, but Google allowed us to do that within a half hour.
And a lot of news, a lot of Facebook sources try to give you information, photos, and videos for news to verify stuff. So that kind of verification that he just did on that photo was amazing. You know, and a lot of people can do that. It's not that difficult to do. There was a famous fake news story about the size of the crowd at the inauguration. And so you looked at the photos and how they came out. And you looked at backtrack to see what the original photos were and who took them and when were they dated from and that kind of stuff. So that's important to do that kind of work. I want to talk a little bit more about shifting advertising model and how that's changing. Everybody who has a cell phone, and mine's sitting right over there, knows that mobile really sort of made the internet take off and social media take off in a way that we can't probably imagine. We can all communicate as we're sitting here and we look at things. And this is money following eyeballs here. Here's mobile internet advertising. Estimated change in annual worldwide advertising spending between 2007 and 2020. This is Zenith, is an advertising agency, and they're doing a projection. Warning, projection. How do they know? How are they going to know that they're going to be true? So take it with a grain of salt. But this is what they're projecting. And they're an industry association, so people are kind of banking on trades and where they should put their money and how they should spend it. So they have to look at projections. What's the interest rate going to be next year? All business people have to look at those kind of things. So this is one. So they see mobile internet advertising grow. They see television advertising grow. They see outdoor advertising. What's that? Billboards, that kind of stuff. Movie, radio, desktop internet, magazines, newspapers. There's some that are projecting on the negative side. Now, I will also tell you this. Newspapers have this. Okay? So you've got to keep in mind that there are no such things as just news organizations that exist in one medium anymore. Not if they're smart. And you have to be smart today. So if you're a newspaper, if you're like the Missoulian, do you have a digital product? You bet you do. Do you have other sorts of digital means of revenue today? You bet you do. They're really important. But one of the problems with digital revenue is that you don't make as much money from digital revenue as you would made from commercial print or advertising that you ran in the newspaper. And that's dropping at a rate where digital revenue is coming up, but this kind of advertising is dropping pretty fast too. So that's a danger sign for them. That's a challenge that the traditional commercial media is watching in all levels. And it's not just newspapers. TV is facing this too. TV has websites. I don't know, have you looked at a TV website lately for a TV station?
Oh, like PBS does.
Yeah, like your local television station. They have websites? Do you go to it very often?
Yeah, they
What
refer
for?
you to it all the time.
Right. So those reporters also have to write web stories now, and sort of just putting the scripts on. So everybody's playing different games. They're trying to be more nimble today. They're trying to come up with different ways so they can make for more digital advertising. So magazines are doing the same things. They're selling apps. They're creating value-added commercial vehicles that are advertisements that will last for a long time. There are some organizations that even help you do your own marketing. And if you think about it, that's what newspapers used to do. If you came to them with an ad or an idea for an ad, they'd say, we could tweak that for you. How about this? Let's make it a little better. Let's reach a little bigger audience by doing this. Let's think of running what day we'll run it. And let's think about what place we put that at, how we position it, how can we maximize that to get your best effect. And that thinking that they did, that creative activity they did, added value to the advertisement which you paid for.
Right.
So they not only played for the space, they played for the creation of that advertising. And that was a really important concept for them, too. And so now you're seeing newspapers do that, big newspapers doing that in a different way. And it's called sponsored content. You'll see it. It's called native advertising. And what it does is sometimes looks like news, but it's usually very carefully labeled, which means I have no problem with it, as long as it's labeled and people know the difference. But the techniques of news and news production are made into advertising to make it more palatable, to make it more easy to assume. We have newspapers that are creating marketing schemes for people. We have newspapers that are creating social media network plans. How are you going to sell on Facebook? Are newspapers doing that? Yeah, they're doing that. I think the newspapers also ought to get some money from Facebook. That's what they do. That's my argument tonight. They ought to make Facebook give some more newspapers some money. And I see they have a grant program now that they're giving to startups and newspapers to promote them. But they have created this environment where that digital advertising is more important, and the people who create a lot of the content aren't getting as much of a share of it as they used to. And that bugs me. And that's my bias. Okay? That bugs me because I know how much it costs to create a story. I know how much it costs to verify and fact check and do that research. And if we're not being compensated, we're getting compensated pennies, and other people are making dollars off of that very same ad, then something's gone askew here. And yet they have no power to be editors. They don't want any responsibility. They just want to let the algorithm run it. I think there's a problem there. I think maybe there's a class action suit. I think there's antitrust problems, but we'll leave that for later. I see a lot of things that I could wish for that may not happen, but here's the reality of what's going on, and that's a challenge for any kind of media today to try to keep up with these kind of projections and to find ways to do that. And that's manifest itself in what happens in newsrooms in your town and your community too. If they don't make up for or keep up with the changes or find ways to maximize the revenues, find ways to keep the news subsidized, then it could disappear in some places.
Why did the Indies go away? Why did it go away?
It couldn't make money. Bottom line. And they tried. Boy, did they try. You know, one thing that newspapers try to do is come up with revenue streams, other revenue streams. And they did obstacle course races, fun runs. They did all sorts of things. There was an outfit in town called NewWest.net, was kind of way ahead of its time, but it was an internet news service, and they would have, it was based on the commercial real estate boom that Missoula was going on in pre-2007 or so. And they would have real estate conferences, and people would pay the News.net to come here to attend these conferences and talk about real estate boom. As soon as the real estate boom busted, that revenue stream went away. So the indies struggled and struggled and struggled to find revenue streams, but the advertising just wasn't there. And they had a little different kind of distribution model. They were free, which meant you had to print a lot of papers, right? You had to get them in lots of different kind of places. So that's what made it difficult for them to kind of survive. Now, could they survive if they had a big, rich sugar daddy? Maybe. And we're seeing that happen in newspaper ownership and news media ownership today, too. Who knows Mr. Bezos? Seeing the news lately? Yes. Washington Post, right? Who knows the owner of, I'm missing some other people's. The guy that owns the LA Times. I can't think of his name right now. But he's another person who's made his money in business, in social media, and has finally decided that, you know, he's going to give something back, right? As a new consumer of news, I'm going to look to see how independent they really are. That'll be one of the tests I have. How well do they cover themselves? How well do they cover their business? How well do these do these kind of things? But I have no problem with big people making a lot of money and then seeking some redemption by owning a good news outlet and putting it back into it. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest awards in journalism, they come from some of the biggest malefactors of yellow journalism, right? The Pulitzer Prizes, the Hearst Awards. You know, a lot of this stuff comes around, and I'm glad it does. But I think it's something that we have to watch for. But I also think there's another media owner you really ought to watch for, and that's hedge funds. Because they don't have quite the concern for community that the other kinds of ownership have, that have ties that are deeper and longer, and to other kinds of investors who care about the community. Because that's what really matters. And we also know, I think, that when we can come together over community news, we can come together in groups like this, we can come together and meet people from different kinds of ways of life and different kinds of thoughts, we create ways out of the filter bubble. We can start to have conversations and discussions. So I guess one of the things I'd like to leave people with tonight is balance your news diet. Think of it as newstrition. And that's coined by a friend of mine named Courtney Kogel, and she loves to talk about nutrition. She also works on a organic farm outside Power, Montana. I like to say she's from near Power, Montana. Anybody know where Power, Montana is? Yeah, he does. Jim knows. But she also shows up. My wife and I have this kind of tradition that on one weekend every summer we run over to Great Falls and we go to the farmer's market. And we stay over at the Holiday Inn or whatever thing it is. The next morning we go to the farmer's market and we go to Courtney's stall and we buy some bread because they make some bread there. And it's our quest for bread to Great Falls. Then we drive home the scenic route and it's a great day. That's what we do. It tells you what we like to do for fun, you know. Sorry, but that's we love those days. But what Courtney will tell you is that, yeah, they bake bread and they sell all sorts of stuff, but the thing she brings the most to the farmer's market is bags and bags of carrots. Why? Because people need carrots. They need lots of carrots. They're cheap and they're nutritious and they're the basis for just about everything, and they can be cooked with everything else in lots of different kinds of ways. She says, I always run out of carrots first. And she is a real believer in local news. And she believes that carrots are like local news. She helps us run a legislative news service, and we have students cover the legislature for really small papers that can't afford to do that around Montana. And Courtney likes to say, we don't tart it up or dumb it down. You know, we give people the carrots of news. And there's a place for that. People want sort of basic kind of information about what's going on, and as we get more time, we can explore them deeper, and we will in context. Or the bigger news organizations will do that kind of stuff too. And I think that creates community. So support your local newspaper. How's that for corny? Who verifies information? Who checks stuff? Who hires people on the basis of doing that?
Well, I don't know how you can check information.
Well, I think there are lots of ways to check information. I told you this.
Seriously, listen to what you've been saying in the last hour, which is, by the way, a most impressive historical rendition of First Amendment history and the power behind it and how we got to this mess we're in, and what this lady just spoke to, which is nationwide global cynicism. Mm-hmm. Because nobody can trust anything anymore. And we're in the age where every story is more unbelievable than the last one. And you say, don't trust anything that's too sensational or too incredible. Well, I don't dare turn it on because and nothing ever comes. Nothing ever happens. I mean, we've been in this probe now for 2 years.
I don't know if everything's going to happen. We could be sitting
You know
here
what
in
I do?
2022 just where we are today, except more salacious, scandalous, incredible, unbelievable stories. So where do you go? Because you have to go to the sources who are part of the very problem that has created this mess.
I go
as
to,
much as I like the Post and I like these other fact-checking places you talk about, they are in the whole process. The only people who can change it are the people like yourself who are teaching the future journalists.
I think
And you have to figure out some way to cut through this, because class action lawsuits are not going to do it. There's no profit in it. But the industry could bring the class action lawsuit. The industry could beg Congress to pass some laws. You can't yell fire in a theater, everybody knows that. There are exceptions to the First Amendment. And you must lay awake at night, because this is your job to teach these future journalists, struggling with how to give them a takeaway that balances the power of the First Amendment against the mess that has been created by the profession.
I have a lot.
What is the solution?
I have. If I do all the answers, I'd be a very wealthy man today, and I probably wouldn't be talking about this. But I think part of the solution is in these seats right here.
Is what?
In your seats right here. And I think one of the things you have to do is change your news diet. I go off certain things every once in a while. It's healthy for me to get off social media sometimes. I find that the world changes if I'm not hooked into that constantly antagonizing bubble that I've become part of. And it gives me a sense of balance that helps me approach questions that I need to ask. And then I also think you have to be skeptical, but you've always had to be skeptical in an information age, in an information society. Most people have negotiated that fairly well in their lives. They don't get took, they don't get scammed. I got a scam the other day to buy, say that my warranty on my car had run out and I better check it again. And I know that it hadn't because I just paid for it. And I said, really, is this true? And my wife says, no, that's a scam. And she's dead right. It was a scam that's been going on anywhere else too. So my questioning helped solve that problem. It was a scam. But I do know what I know. I know it's a scam. But I mean, you can't be perfectly informed. You can't know everything that's out there. It's going to take, knowing what's true today is going to take somebody who's got some balance, but who's also a pretty active player in their own information education. It's no longer just a spectator sport, where you could sit there and just rely on what somebody in an authoritative position told you what was true or what was not. And that's what I mean about Cronkite. I love Walter Cronkite, but when Walter Cronkite held his mirror up to the world, he didn't include everybody who was out there either.
But isn't there a higher duty on the profession of journalism to safeguard the consumers?
Well, I believe that, but I also believe that there's a lot of different practitioners, and I can't make laws for them. I could try to, but Congress shall make no law. I mean, the First Amendment, you mentioned it. And I worry about government ownership of media. I do. And when you talk about that second newspaper in America, I worry about that problem. I worry about what government ownership of the media would look like today. So that's a problem.
Because free press is destroying truth.
Well, I think if you know how to use it, and you can be more skeptical about how you use it, and you can look at your news diet and balance it, you're going to have a better idea. I think you need more choices. I think you also need local news sources that are people that you bump into every day. I mean, when I know my local newspaper, I know my editors, I know reporters, I can hold them to some sort of standard because I see them all the time. Really? You ran that story there? Isn't that a problem? And then Jim can tell you the kind of phone calls they get from people who care about things enough in this town that they're constantly checking with them. So I think what I said, support your local newspaper, it really is kind of important. That takes you out of the endless sort of national spin and game that you kind of play and gives you kind of a perspective. It's really easy to get sucked into this vortex, this polar news vortex that you can see on social medias, and I think you have to find a way to give yourself a break from that. You have to find a way to stop from that. I worry about it for children. I worry about how much time you spend on these kind of things. So I think you do need kind of a break, but I also think it holds an incredible promise too. It can help educate us. It can help us collaborate to find different kind of sources. It can help people who want to find the truth get together and find their own fund and organize their own organizations to do that.
Will the prospect of any regulation of Facebooks and Googles of the country, of the world, the prospect of regulation help that?
Well, there is pushback coming from Europe. And there's Facebook rules and regulations. They're saying you can't sell people's privacy stuff. You have to make it totally transparent. You have to use common language. You've seen some aspects of that movement in the United States and California and some elsewhere, but I think it's going to be a tougher deal to try to get that across the United States, where people have a tradition of inspecting a First Amendment, because First Amendment protects too. Protects your right to speech. And if you give it away to somebody else who's suddenly telling you what to say and what to believe, that's a slippery slope. And it scares me. Even the fairness doctrine, some people would argue, was something to be afraid of. Because what it did was bring timidity to news, not really sort of a vibrant conversation in a lot of ways. It may have sounded like it created this give and take, but in practice it really didn't, because nobody wanted to give away their airtime. So I think you've got to trust organizations that provide forums, that provide exchanges, that provide sort of kind of fact-checking too. You've got to go for the carrots. You've got to go for news that nourishes you. And I think you've got to go for news that creates community. And that's not always easy to do, but it also means being part of communities. If you sit home and you watch that cycle constantly, you're going to go crazy. I think it's so easy to get wrapped up into that it's hard to see things very clearly. You have to find ways out of it, and you have to find people who you can trust, and how do you measure them? We talked about that. You're going to find people who trust, that are credible, that have a track record, and admit when they're wrong. And there's not a whole lot of people who do that when you really get down to it. Who does that in your community? What news organizations run corrections? It's usually your local newspaper.
Meaningful correction.
Yeah, meaningful corrections. I'm not talking about typos, or even though those things hurt credibility. Even a name misspelled hurts like you wouldn't believe. But when they make a major mistake on the reporting of a story or the way it was done, they're pretty good about saying why we screwed that up. And that's part of that. When you have a kid and they say they did something, you want to know, well, why did you do that? You can't just say, me so sorry. You want to know why they did it so they don't do it again. And that's part of a news organization that cares about truth, too. So look for those kind of things. Also, hold your local journalists up to the standards that you believe in. And that may not sound like an easy thing to do, but I think there are a lot of news organizations that are looking to their communities for support right now. They're under some strain. They're under some stress, and they want to know what you care about, because they want to serve you. And they want to know what it is you want to have them report on. But you want to give them the independence and the resources to do that. That's why I mean support them, because it doesn't happen without resources. And that's a part of the equation that's becoming more and more difficult, I think. Yeah.
Well, could you comment on why so many of the professional talking heads on the news media got it wrong in predicting the 2018 election?
I think people thought they had kind of a confirmation bias going on with a lot of people. I don't think anybody thought that Trump could win. I don't think he thought he could win. I think he might have been surprised too by what happened there. So there was a lot of people that sort of wrote you off, wrote voters off, didn't believe that they would elect him, and maybe there's some comeuppance and all of that. So I do think that, news organizations are no different than people sometimes. They can fall into ruts. They can fall into confirmation biases. They can fall into different kind of spheres. I think about weapons of mass destruction. And I think about which news organizations told you about that. I'm proud to have worked for one that did that. Knight Ridder newspapers told you about that. They did. But a lot of the networks and the big guys didn't tell you about that.
One thing, too, looking back to the last election, you're talking about polls. It's interesting too, on a national poll on a presidential election, you have to realize that those polls are not predicting the electoral college, they're predicting the popular vote. And a lot of people forget that. They say that all those polls were wrong, but actually, you know who won the popular vote.
Yeah.
To do an electoral college, you have to go state by state by state, and that's extremely expensive. To do a balanced one in every state and determine how that state's going to go.
And it was Kellyanne Conway who decided there were 3 states to concentrate on for the Trump campaign.
Well,
And they were the ones that carried him.
And that was correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to know why you think TV, normal network news is watered down so now. It's pablum. I won't even watch it anymore.
Well,
CBS,
it's-
NBC, ABC.
Well, it's time constraints are short. It always has been. A half-hour nightly newscast. Think about it. How much time, when you take the ads out, how much news is it? It's not much.
15 minutes, but
Yeah, there's just not much there. There's not much time for much there. And yet that's kind of been the template they've used for a long time. News organizations can get stuck in ruts in the way they work and the way they do things. And they've tried it with news magazines. 60 Minutes was a big example. They're expanding Today shows, morning shows. Late Night with Ted Koppel. There was explosions in different kinds of times to try to get more news. But that's not necessarily where people are watching. TV's kind of a different beast, too. When you think about it, when you watch television, how much of your time is spent on news?
that's what I watch.
When you read a newspaper, how much time is spent on news? Probably a different ratio, I'm guessing. It's because they're different beats, unless you're in the horoscopes or all the time, or in the crossword puzzles, where they have their diversions too. But they don't have programming that's where they really make their money, right? Programming is where they really make their money. News is a much smaller part of their ecosphere, unless you are Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. And what are they? 24-hour news channels. And what do they feature mostly? How much news is on a 24-hour news channel? There's a lot of people on there talking about news that somebody else reported. There's a lot of punditry.
Predicting what somebody's
Yes.
going to say.
There's a lot of people commenting and a lot of time for opinion or speculation, heaven forbid, that would happen on cable news shows. So it's a different beast and a different organism. And you have to understand this jungle, to know what you're going to get and where to spend your time. I have a brother-in-law who watches one of these all news channels, I won't name it, all the time. And I told him, don't you watch anything else? Don't you read anything? Don't you read a paper? And I said, he said, it's just driving me crazy. I said, you got to get out of there. I said, you got to go see something else. And he said, because he was just crazy. And he said, the whole world's going to hell. And that's the way he felt. And he's a pretty successful businessman who has upward trajectory for his business and his life and his family. So it's like he's extraordinarily worried about the shape of the world for good reasons. He's an immigrant, for one thing. So he's worried about a lot of other things, too. But he is so glued into his 24-hour news channel that he has a hard time escaping it. And I think, I would just say, turn it off. Go do some work. Go on a diet. Eat some carrots.
Is that really a solution?
It is a solution, because you know what he doesn't read? He doesn't read that.
It begs the question, sir. The profession has to get out in front of this tidal wave, because the cynicism and the paranoia, these two extremes of playing ostrich ball, I can't stand to look at it, I'm not even going to turn it on, I'm not going to read it, you can't fact check any, you can't trust any. They said weapons of mass destruction, they said he was going to lose to her by several points, and whether you read it or you watch it or you hear it, they're all saying the same thing. I'm too busy, I'm just trying to earn a living, I can't trust any of this. So I can't have a population.
Can I offer one possible answer? You're not talking about news, I don't think, so much as you're talking about a zeitgeist among the citizenry.
Well, I'm talking about everybody here has a certain level of angst that they probably didn't have when they were watching Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yeah. I agree.
And It doesn't matter which political party you're a part of. Everybody feels this same overworked sensation of, oh my God, when is it going to stop?
Here's an
Can
I offer an answer to that? Okay, you done? The answer I would offer you is we go in cycles. We go in cycles of anxiety and cynicism. This is an anxious time in our country, and this preceded Donald, okay? And we hopefully are going to find ways to swing back, and it's not all about journalism that's going to swing us back, so that people are going to be more open, they're going to climb somewhat out of their news silos when they're less anxious and less cynical from that. But that leads me to another question I want to ask, which I haven't heard you guys talk about, which is, what do you realistically think is going to save local newspapering? Because right now the ones that I see surviving are the New York Times, the LA Times, or whatever, who can put up paywalls and get readership. Most newspapers can't do
Missoula has a
that.
paywall. Missoula has a paywall.
Okay, is that working, and do you see the future of that bringing you the revenue you need?
Well, Dennis outlined it pretty well that digitally right now, about 34% of our revenue this last month came from digital, still 66 print. I'd say in the next 5 years is where we'll reach the inflection point where we'll be getting more of our revenue from digital than print. And but it's a tricky balance. We're reaching more people than we ever have, but the model that we're doing is more challenging from the advertising side because it's much more fragmented. That's why we're relying on subscribers to support a larger percentage of the cost right now. There's no question. That's what newspapers are going to. Somebody asked about the independent. It's really hard for free model papers because they don't have that. And in the case of the independent press, the alt weeklies, as they lost really all their classified, all those personal editor, all that went away, and it was hard to replace. For a while, they had a good source with the with the medicinal marijuana, and then that went away. So when you go back to traditional newspapers, it continues to be a way that we have to find new revenue streams. That's why we sell not only our audience, and we had 7 million page views last month, but we also sell targeted. We also sell, targeted outside of our reach. People want to reach people in Chicago who might want to visit Missoula. We'll serve those audiences. So we do, search engine optimization. We do website enhancement. We're doing more with events. We have to find new revenue streams.
And some of those are made possible by the internet. Some of those are made possible by, kind of the social connections you can do online. So there's hope in some of that too, but it's tricky.
Yeah, we have not. People sometimes will say, you lost your audience to the internet. Like, no, we have more than ever. We lost. Yeah, the classified, employment advertising, auto advertising. Those are two segments that we don't get near what we used to. We still get a fair amount of auto, but employment we get 10% of what we used to. So that's just the way it is.
And what'll happen to print?
Print, that's really up to the consumer. As long as there is a large enough audience out there to continue who want it in that format, will continue to provide it. I don't see us leaving the print, anytime soon. Eventually we will. Eventually it will be all digital. But what year that is, I don't know. And some markets, markets that have tried it already, it hasn't worked as well. Some of the Michigan markets and that, they're having real problems as far as people aren't going with them. It's too much hubris for us to say, here's where we're going, follow us. We have to continue to be, like I say, if we want it in print, we have to continue to be there while balancing how to provide it on the phone. And remember, when I say digital, it's the e-paper, it's the desktop, and it's mobile. They're all very different audiences. So it's not just two audiences. We're looking at 4 or 5. So.
It's incredibly complex, and you have to serve an audience that's used to getting it in a format that they've had for generations now. Now, so the better question might be to ask your kid, ask your grandkid, you know, where are they going to get their news as time moves on? And if you're talking about digitally native people, they're going to get it digitally, I suspect. You know, that's the way they'll move. I may be the last guy, you know, to read a newspaper. I think it'll be around longer than that. I think it actually has a niche appeal in certain markets. But I also think another thing that's going to keep news alive is support from readers and people who gravitate to them toward news and engage in their community. But it's also going to take partnerships. It's also going to take new thinking about how they provide services and even how they do news. I don't think it's going to take away from verification, but they may have to bring in people to help them cover things that they couldn't before. And you're already seeing a lot of that around the country. You're seeing ProPublica partner with news organizations. You're seeing people working on projects together that hadn't happened before. And I think that's a healthy way to gain some community too. But I think that the most important thing is to make sure that you're connected and engaged with your community as a means, not an end. I mean, you really do have to work with people to find out what they want to know about. What do you think are carrots around here? You know, I mean, what is it you want to do? There's an outfit that I know Jim's familiar with. They're called the Solutions Journalism Network. And what they have done is convene communities to say, what should we be covering? What is it you care about that we're not covering? What is it we really should be talking about? And a bunch of newspapers in Montana went with this model, and they came up with, I think it was how to expand the economy, economic development. How are they going to do that? And they did it in different ways in different little papers across the state. And it turned out to be a pretty gratifying experience for those communities and for their editors. One of the newspaper's editors was named the Marshal in her 4th of July parade. That tells you something. You know, I mean, it's hard to imagine otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, she's
No, I'm sorry. I'm skewed.
You might be able to offer some insight, but you as well. I'm curious just to wrap my head around some of the numbers here. I also understand this question was a bit undefined, but if you were to remove advertising from the Missoulian, and the Missoulian had to be funded by its subscribers, what does that look like? Are we talking per person, per day, $5, $10? What does that look like?
Well, the average subscription rate right now would be you're looking at well, say how you say $400 a year, it would be about $1,500 a year.
Oh, per person.
Yeah, if you took away, because you know, advertising, circulation used to be at some papers only 15%. In Montana, typically was more like 25%, but that percentage is still less than a third.
I mean, that's what I mean by news has always been subsidized. And how do you pay for that now that you can measure the value of every piece of news in some way? And it's created, one model we haven't really talked about is public television or public radio. And that's a different model that seems to be kind of robust sometimes, but they're also kind of controversial. But they're almost, I would say, they're probably more of a subscriber model than anything. Is that right? I mean, they have to do these incredible fund drives to buy most of their programming, which isn't news, by the way. Most of their programming isn't news, it's other things. And then they have some money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and I can't remember the percentage, but I know it's less than 20, and I think it's less than 15, what they really get from that corporation. And there are critics who say they shouldn't get any of that. You know, people in free market think, why are we subsidizing this news outfit over this news outfit? Why are we making those kinds of choices? But they seem to have a model, and one of the things I like about them is the tone and the tenor. And you listen to NPR or you listen to Montana Public Radio, and what do you hear compared to what you hear on cable TV?
I listen to them all the time. I don't listen to cable TV, so I can't make it.
Well, I mean, it is a calmer tone. It is a way to kind of talk to you about things that they think you may care about. Now, it can be overweening and peachy. Sometimes it can be a little, kind of goofy too. It's got its critics. But I do think it also, I mean, some of the people who have been in it are its biggest critics. I know them. But in terms of how they connect and the news they provide, they've been fairly successful here in Montana lately, in western Montana, and it's almost all local stuff. So again, local news matters. Local news is the place where you can get out of the swirl. I mean, you'll have a emotional sort of debate. You'll have people that are going to be disagreeing about things, but there are still things that you can be a part of, and you can verify and you can check the sources because you tend to know them better. You are closer to that news. That's news that you can affect in a way that I think might even be empowering. And again, it cuts across these polarized lines that the national news would try to put us in sometimes. So again, support local news. Eat your carrots. I keep saying that, but I do think it's really important. And I think, when they ask for your help and your solutions and your ideas, give it to them. I think they do want to know what's going on out there. They do want to know the things that you want to cover. And it's not just because they're chasing clicks. They know that they have a community interest. And they're not just chasing clicks. They do stories that don't get any clicks, right? I remember somebody told me one time I did something at the Bozeman Chronicle where I was the editor, and he said, "Oh, you just did that to sell newspapers." And I just about laughed out loud. What a rude thing to do, to laugh out loud. But I don't think I ever sold a newspaper based on something I'd written or reported. My publisher used to call me the revenue reducing department. And I would laugh, but that's I was a cost, And I knew that. And I can only think of one time that I ever did something in the newspaper to sell newspapers. And that was when we had the Wally Byams caravans? They're the Airstream guys. 8,000 of them came to Bozeman. And they parked all outside the Brick Breeden Field House, and I rented a plane and sent a photographer up and took a picture and put it on the front page. We sold, I don't know how, and I said, there, I'm done. I've sold newspapers. I've met my obligation to you. I don't know if it was that. But there was a kid that was even better because he went out and mowed their lawns and made a ton of money. So it just means that I think a lot of news people who work at the local level, they care about the economic health of their newspaper, but they also care about the community connections that they have, because without that, it kind of all crumbles. They know that matters, and they know that if they don't care about that, because when they get done reading their stories, they see you. They see you in the grocery store, they see you in the produce aisle, and that's true in Helena, covering the legislature, as true as it is covering things that go on in Missoula. So I think that's where you have the most effect, you have the most input, and the most sort of control over your news diet is to be a part of that. And I don't think they would think that's a bad thing, to have you call them up with ideas or suggestions, or join them in ideas that they want to do to engage community going forward. It's harder for them to do if they don't have the robust staff they once had. So that's something you have to think about too. So how can we help? How can we do things to cover things and make sure they're still verified, there's still good news judgment, and they're still in the hands of editors? It's not an easy time, and there's not going to be an easy answer to any of these things, but one thing that really helps is having discussions like this. So I thank you all for your questions, and I thank you all for the things that you added to that. So please, good job.